The day started like any other, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I watched Laura move around the bedroom, tying her golden hair into a messy bun. She hummed to herself as she packed her yoga bag, her every movement fluid, precise. That calmness she radiated, people always said it was contagious, but to me, it was a barrier, something I couldn't reach. "Don't forget about dinner tonight," she said with a smile, kissing me on the cheek before heading out the door. I nodded, distracted. "Yeah, see you at 6. Her smile lingered in my mind long after the door closed behind her. It felt too perfect, too practiced. Maybe I was imagining things. Or maybe I wasn't. That evening, I was scrolling through my work emails on my laptop when Laura's voice drifted down the hall. "Can you text Maggie and let her know Saturday works for brunch?" she called. "Sure," I replied, standing and heading toward the dining table where her phone usually rested. Except it wasn't there. It was on the kitchen counter instead, screen glowing softly. I wasn't looking for anything. I swear I wasn't. But then I saw the message preview. "Can't stop thinking about last night. Warrior pose never felt so intense." The words hit me like a punch to the chest. My hands froze mid-reach, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. The message wasn't from Maggie. It wasn't from anyone I recognized. It was from an unsaved number. I told myself not to overreact. Maybe it was a joke or a misunderstanding. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. But deep down, I knew better. When Laura came home later, she was smiling again. That same perfect smile, like nothing had changed. She set her yoga bag by the door and kissed me on the cheek. "What's for dinner?" "Pasta," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Her face lit up. "Perfect. I am starving." I couldn't eat. I couldn't even look at her without hearing the words from that text echoing in my mind. That night, as Laura slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, replaying every interaction we'd had over the past few weeks. The late yoga classes, the way she always talked about Elliot, her instructor, the little moments when she seemed distracted, her mind somewhere else. Was I paranoid? Or was I finally seeing something that had been in front of me all along? The next day, I couldn't focus at work. By lunchtime, I decided I needed answers. I left the office and drove to Laura's yoga studio, parking across the street. The building was sleek and modern, its frosted windows giving it a sense of privacy that suddenly felt sinister. Through the glass doors, I could see a class in session. My heart clenched as I spotted Laura in the front row, moving through the poses with effortless grace. And there he was, Elliot Crane. He moved with confidence, adjusting students' postures and demonstrating poses. He stopped beside Laura, leaning close to whisper something. She laughed, her smile bright and unguarded. My stomach twisted. It wasn't just her smile. It was the way she looked at him, like he was the center of her world. That evening, over dinner, I tried to test the waters. "How's yoga going?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. Laura's face lit up. "It's amazing. Elliot says I'm making real progress." I nodded, forcing a smile. "He sounds like a great instructor. Do you ever work with anyone else there?" Her expression flickered. Just for a moment, but it was enough. "Not really," she said quickly. "Elliot handles the advanced classes." I wanted to push further, to ask why she was so defensive, but I held back. I didn't want her to know what I was thinking. Not yet. The next morning, while Laura was in the shower, I searched her purse. I wasn't proud of it, but I couldn't stop myself. That's when I found the receipt. A folded slip of paper from a high-end hotel downtown. The date on the receipt made my heart sink. Last Thursday, the night she told me she was out with friends. When Laura came home that evening, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Where were you last Thursday?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. She blinked, caught off guard. "Out with Maggie and the girls," she said. I held up the receipt. "Then why does this say you were at the Midtown Hotel?" Her face paled, but she recovered quickly. "It was for work," she said, her tone defensive. "We had a client dinner, and I didn't want to bother you with it." "Why are you going through my things?" I clenched my jaw. "Because I feel like you're hiding something." Her eyes narrowed. "You're being ridiculous," she snapped, snatching the receipt from my hand. "I can't believe you don't trust me." She stormed out of the room, leaving me standing there, my chest tight with anger and hurt. That night, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the spot where her yoga mat usually rested. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust her. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was lying to me. And I was going to find out the truth. The days after finding that hotel receipt were some of the longest I'd ever endured. Laura and I barely spoke, the tension in the house, so thick I could feel it pressing against my chest. She carried on as if nothing had happened, leaving for yoga, smiling when she returned, dropping little comments about how good her classes were. It drove me insane. The hotel receipt wasn't just a slip of paper. It was a seed of doubt that had taken root, spreading through my mind like a weed. I couldn't stop thinking about it, couldn't stop replaying her quick, defensive answer. A work dinner? Really? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Laura left for another yoga session on Thursday evening, her mat slung over her shoulder. She kissed me goodbye at the door, her smile bright but slightly strained. "Don't wait up," she said. "I might stay late to help Elliot clean up." I nodded, watching her go. My hands were balled into fists, my fingernails digging into my palms. The moment her car pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed my keys. I parked a block away from the yoga studio, my heart pounding as I waited. I felt ridiculous, like some kind of stalker, but I couldn't stop myself. If Laura wasn't going to tell me the truth, I'd find it myself. Through the frosted windows, I could see silhouettes moving in synchronized motions. Laura's shape was unmistakable, her movements fluid and precise. I spotted Elliot too, his posture confident as he moved between the rows of students, adjusting their forms and demonstrating poses. My stomach churned when he stopped beside Laura. He leaned close to speak to her, his hand lightly touching her shoulder. She laughed, her head tilting back slightly. It was a sound I hadn't heard from her in weeks. I clenched the steering wheel, my jaw tightening as I watched. It wasn't overt, but there was something too familiar about the way they interacted. When the class ended, I slid lower in my seat as Laura walked out. She was chatting with another student, her face flushed and glowing. She looked happy, carefree. It made me sick. Laura got in her car and drove off, and I didn't follow her this time. Instead, I stayed parked outside the studio, watching as Elliot locked up. He lingered inside for a while, the lights dimming before he finally came out. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper. "Can you send me the link to your yoga studio's schedule?" I asked Laura casually over breakfast. She raised an eyebrow, but didn't question me. "Why?" "I'm thinking of taking a class," I lied. Her face lit up. "Really? That's great. I think it would be good for you." She sent me the link, and I spent the afternoon researching everything I could about Elliot Crane. His bio on the studio's website was standard enough. Certified instructor, passionate about wellness, blah, blah, blah. But a quick search of his social media painted a different picture. There were photos of him with his students, always in close poses that bordered on intimate. Smiling selfies with captions like, "Guiding energy into balance." It made my skin crawl. One post stood out, a group photo from a retreat last summer. Laura was in it, her arm draped casually over Elliot's shoulder. She looked happy, carefree. I stared at the photo for what felt like hours, the knot in my stomach tightening. That evening, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Elliot seems like an interesting guy," I said as we sat down at dinner. Laura looked up from her plate, her expression cautious. "He is," she said carefully. "Do you spend a lot of time with him outside of class?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. She hesitated just for a second, but it was enough. "Not really," she said, her voice too light. I nodded, pretending to accept her answer. But inside, my frustration was boiling over. The next day, while Laura was at work, I searched her car. I wasn't proud of it, but at this point, I didn't care. Under the driver's seat, I found a folded business card for the yoga studio. On the back, written in Elliot's neat handwriting, were the words, "Let's make time to talk." My hands shook as I stared at the card. That night, Laura came home later than usual, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly disheveled. "Sorry I'm late," she said, setting her bag by the door. Class ran over. I couldn't stop myself. "Elliot keeping you busy?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Her head snapped toward me, her eyes narrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" I shrugged, trying to act nonchalant. "Just seems like you're spending a lot of time there lately." She crossed her arms, her expression defensive. "It's a yoga studio, Mark. That's kind of the point." I dropped it, but the tension between us was palpable. The next morning, I installed a hidden camera in the living room, angled to capture the front door. If she was sneaking anyone into the house while I was at work, I'd know. For days, I watched the footage obsessively, but there was nothing. Laura's comings and goings were exactly as she'd said. Until Friday. Friday afternoon, Laura came home earlier than expected, carrying a bouquet of flowers. She set them on the counter, her face softening as she read the card attached. She smiled, a real, unguarded smile. My chest tightened as I watched the footage later that night, her reaction replaying in my mind over and over again. Who had sent her flowers? That evening, I confronted her. Who gave you those flowers? I asked, my voice tight. Laura froze, her eyes wide. What are you talking about? I saw them on the counter, I said. You came home with them this afternoon. Who are they from? Her face flushed, and she crossed her arms. A friend, she said. What kind of friend? I pressed. She hesitated, then sighed. It's nothing, Mark. Just someone from the studio. They were thanking me for helping with an event. Her explanation felt thin, but I didn't push further. I could tell she was lying, but without proof, I was stuck. The following week, I followed her again. Instead of coming straight home after yoga, she drove to a hotel, the same hotel from the receipt. I parked across the street, my hands trembling as I watched her enter. She stayed inside for nearly 2 hours. When she finally came out, she wasn't alone. A man walked beside her, his hand brushing against hers. I couldn't see his face clearly, but his posture and build were eerily familiar. My stomach churned. Was it Elliot? I gripped the steering wheel, my mind spiraling. I needed to know the truth, and I was going to find it. The image of Laura walking out of that hotel with a man burned itself into my mind. I couldn't stop replaying it. Her easy smile, the way her hand almost brushed his as they talked. I didn't know who he was or what they had been doing, but it didn't matter. It confirmed everything I feared. Laura was hiding something, and I was going to uncover it. The hotel receipt, the flowers, the text message, all of it pointed to a truth I wasn't ready to face. But I couldn't keep pretending nothing was wrong. I couldn't keep waiting for her to come clean. The next day, while Laura was at work, I went to the yoga studio. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to be there, to see the place with fresh eyes and figure out what I'd missed. The receptionist greeted me warmly, her smile too bright. How can I help you? I hesitated, my nerves frayed. I'm thinking of joining, I said. She handed me a brochure, her tone cheerful. We have classes for all levels. Are you looking for something beginner-friendly? I nodded, scanning the schedule absently. My wife's been encouraging me to try yoga, I added. She comes here all the time? Laura Taylor? The receptionist's face lit up with recognition. Oh yes, Laura's wonderful. She's been taking Elliot's advanced classes for a while now. Elliot? I asked, feigning casual interest. He's one of our best instructors, she said. And Laura's one of his favorites. Favorites. The word felt like a punch to the gut. I left the studio feeling worse than when I arrived. The receptionist had no idea what she'd just told me, but her words confirmed what I already suspected. Laura's relationship with Elliot wasn't just professional. That night, I installed another camera, this one in our bedroom. I told myself it was a precaution, but deep down, I was hoping for something more concrete, something I could use to confront her. For days, I watched Laura's movements obsessively. Her schedule was consistent, her habits predictable. But there was always something off, little things I couldn't put my finger on. Then, on Wednesday evening, something changed. Laura left for her usual class, her demeanor calm and cheerful. I waited until she was gone before checking the footage from earlier that day. Around noon, Laura had come home unexpectedly. She wasn't alone. The man from the hotel was with her. My chest tightened as I watched them enter the house. They stood in the living room, talking in hushed tones. Laura's posture was tense, her arms crossed over her chest. The man reached out, touching her shoulder lightly, and she flinched. They didn't stay long. After a few minutes, the man left, and Laura stood in the doorway, staring after him. Her expression was unreadable, but her hands were trembling. When Laura came home that night, I forced myself to act normal. How was class? I asked, keeping my voice steady. Great, she said, her smile quick and practiced. Elliot says I'm ready to lead some group sessions soon. That's exciting, I said, pretending to be impressed. But inside, I was boiling. The next morning, I decided to take things a step further. I called the yoga studio, pretending to be interested in private lessons. We'd love to set something up for you, the receptionist said. Elliot has some availability next week if you're interested. That sounds perfect, I said. She scheduled me for a session on Tuesday, and I hung up, my mind racing. When Tuesday arrived, I walked into the studio with my heart pounding. Elliot greeted me at the door, his handshake firm and his smile easy. "You must be Mark," he said. "Laura's told me a lot about you." The mention of her name made my stomach twist. "All good things, I hope," I said, forcing a smile. He chuckled. "Of course. She's a great student." The session started innocently enough. Elliot guided me through basic poses, his instructions clear and professional. But as we moved through the hour, I couldn't help studying him. His body language, his tone, the way he talked about yoga like it was the center of the universe. There was nothing overtly suspicious about him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. When the session ended, I lingered pretending to stretch. "Thanks for the lesson," I said casually. "Laura's lucky to have a teacher like you." Elliot smiled, but there was something in his eyes, something I couldn't quite read. "She's one of my best students," he said. "Very dedicated." That word again. Dedicated. I left the studio with more questions than answers. Later that week, I reviewed the footage from the living room camera again. Laura hadn't brought the man back since that day, but she was still acting strange. Leaving earlier for class, coming home later, avoiding eye contact when I asked about her schedule. I couldn't take it anymore. That Friday, I confronted her. "Who was the man in the living room?" I asked, my voice sharp. Laura froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "What are you talking about?" "I saw him," I said. "He was here on Wednesday." "Don't lie to me." Her face went pale, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. Instead, she sighed, setting her fork down. "He's just a friend," she said. "Someone from the studio." "Do all your friends show up unannounced and make you look like you're about to cry?" I asked, my voice rising. Laura flinched, her eyes filling with tears. "You don't understand," she said softly. "Then make me understand," I snapped. But she didn't. She stood and left the room, leaving me alone with my anger and my questions. That night, I decided to set a trap. I called the yoga studio, posing as Elliot's assistant, and scheduled an emergency session for late Saturday night. I told them to keep it off the books and to let only one person know Laura. When Saturday came, I hid in the studio's supply closet, my heart pounding as I waited. Around 10:30, Laura arrived. She wasn't alone. The man from the hotel was with her. The studio was dark except for the dim glow of the emergency lights near the exits. The supply closet I had crammed myself into was stifling, the scent of cleaning supplies and lavender floor polish making me lightheaded. My heart raced as I stared through the thin gap in the door, every sound amplified in the silence. It wasn't long before I heard the soft creak of the main entrance door opening. Footsteps followed, light and hesitant, growing louder as they approached the studio. I strained my neck to see through the sliver of space. Laura stepped into view, her yoga mat slung over her shoulder, her posture tense. I expected her to be alone, but then he walked in behind her. The man from the hotel. He wasn't Elliot. He was shorter, with a stockier build and dark hair that curled at the edges. He wasn't anyone I recognized, but the familiarity with which Laura spoke to him sent a fresh wave of nausea through me. They stood in the middle of the studio, talking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but their body language spoke volumes. Laura's arms were crossed over her chest, her movements jittery. The man reached out, touching her shoulder lightly, and she didn't pull away. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms as I fought the urge to burst out of the closet. Instead, I forced myself to stay put, to keep watching. I needed to know the truth, no matter how much it hurt. After a few minutes of talking, Laura and the man sat down on their mats, their voices carrying more clearly now. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," Laura said, her voice trembling. "You don't have to," the man replied. "You know I'll support whatever you decide." Her laugh was bitter, almost hollow. "It's not that simple. You don't understand what it's like to be in my position." "Then explain it to me," he said, his tone soft but insistent. I couldn't take it anymore. My pulse thundered in my ears as I shoved the closet door open and stepped into the studio. Laura's head snapped toward me, her face paling instantly. "Mark," she whispered, her voice a mix of shock and fear. The man stood quickly, his expression unreadable. "Who the hell is he?" I demanded, my voice echoing in the empty space. Laura opened her mouth, but no sound came out. I said, "Who is he?" I repeated, my voice rising. The man stepped forward, his hands raised as if to calm me. "Take it easy," he said. "We were just talking." I ignored him, my eyes fixed on Laura. "You lied to me," I said, my voice breaking. "You've been lying to me for months." "Why, Laura? What the hell is going on?" Tears filled her eyes as she finally found her voice. "It's not what you think," she said softly. "Then tell me." I snapped. The man put a hand on Laura's arm, but she shook it off. "It's okay," she said, her voice trembling. She turned to me, her shoulders slumping as if the weight of her secrets had finally become too much to bear. "His name is Ryan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's someone I've been confiding in." "Confiding in?" I repeated bitterly. "That's what you're calling it now?" Her tears spilled over as she shook her head. "It's not like that, Mark. I swear. I've been unhappy, and I didn't know how to tell you. Ryan's been helping me figure things out." Ryan stepped forward again, his tone calm but firm. "Look, I get that this is a lot to take in," he said, "but Laura hasn't done anything wrong. She just needed someone to talk to." "Someone to talk to?" I spat. "Is that why you were at the hotel together? Why you been sneaking around behind my back?" Laura's face crumpled, and she covered her mouth with her hand, her sobs shaking her shoulders. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she said, her voice muffled. "I never wanted to hurt you, Mark." I turned to Ryan, my anger boiling over. "And what about you? Who the hell do you think you are, inserting yourself into my marriage?" Ryan held my gaze, his expression steady. "I didn't mean to cause any problems," he said. "But Laura needed someone, and I couldn't turn her away." I clenched my fists, my body trembling with the effort to hold myself back. "You're unbelievable," I said, my voice cold. "Both of you." Laura stepped toward me, her tears streaming down her face. "Mark, please," she said. "I know I've made mistakes, but I need you to understand." "Understand what?" I snapped. "That you've been lying to me? That you've been sneaking around with him while I've been at home, wondering why my wife doesn't look at me the same way anymore." Her sobs grew louder, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. Instead, I turned and walked out of the studio, slamming the door behind me. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to ask and answers I wasn't sure I could handle. Laura came home an hour later, her face blotchy from crying. She sat across from me at the dining table, her hands trembling as she reached for mine. "Mark, I'm so sorry," she said softly. "Why, Laura?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Why didn't you just talk to me?" She shook her head, her tears falling again. "I didn't know how," she said. "I felt so lost, and I didn't want to burden you." Her words cut deep, but they weren't enough to erase the pain. "I don't know if I can forgive this," I said honestly. Laura nodded, her tears spilling over. "I understand," she said, "but I want to try. Please, Mark, let me try." I sighed, the weight of everything pressing down on me. "We'll see," I said finally. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no. For now, it was all I could give. The house felt hollow in the days after the confrontation at the yoga studio. Laura and I moved through the same spaces, but never quite occupied them together. When we spoke, it was superficial, questions about errands, comments about dinner. The deeper conversations, the ones we desperately needed to have, stayed buried under a mountain of silence. I wasn't sure if it was anger, fear, or something else keeping me from pushing her. All I knew was that every time I looked at her, I saw Ryan. The way he had touched her arm, the way she had let him, it was enough to make me sick. One night, as Laura slept beside me, I found myself scrolling through the footage from the living room camera. I had watched it a dozen times, dissecting every moment for details I might have missed. But this time, something stood out, something I hadn't noticed before. When Ryan left the house that day, he wasn't empty-handed. He was carrying a small envelope. The realization hit me like a jolt of electricity. I rewound the footage, pausing at the moment he stepped out the door. The envelope was plain, unmarked, but its presence was undeniable. What was he taking? And why hadn't Laura mentioned it? The next morning, I waited until Laura left for work before searching the house. I started in the bedroom, opening drawers and rifling through her desk. Nothing seemed out of place. I moved to the living room next, checking the bookshelf, the cabinets, even the couch cushions. Again, nothing. It wasn't until I reached the closet in the hallway that I found it, a shoebox tucked away on the top shelf. Inside were letters. Dozens of them, all handwritten, all addressed to Laura. My hands trembled as I unfolded the first one. Laura, I don't know how to explain how I feel when I'm with you. It's like everything makes sense again, like the world is finally right. I know this is complicated, but I'm willing to take the risk if you are. Please, just say the word, and I'm yours. The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Elliot. The box slipped from my hands, the letters scattering across the floor. Elliot. All this time, I had assumed Ryan was the problem. I had confronted Laura, searched the house, watched hours of footage, all while the truth was right in front of me. It wasn't Ryan. It had never been Ryan. It was Elliot. That night, I waited for Laura to come home, the shoebox sitting on the table between us like a bomb waiting to go off. When she walked in, her eyes widened at the sight of it. Mark, she said softly, her voice shaking. I can explain. Explain? I repeated, my voice cold. Explain what, Laura? That you've been lying to me for months? That while I was trying to fix our marriage, you were sneaking around with your yoga instructor? She flinched, her tears starting to fall. It wasn't like that, she said, her voice breaking. I didn't mean for it to happen. But it did, I snapped. You let it happen. Her sobs grew louder, but I didn't let up. How long? I demanded. How long has this been going on? Laura hesitated, her hands trembling as she wiped her tears. Since the retreat, she admitted finally. The retreat? I echoed, my stomach turning. The one last summer? The one you begged me to let you go to? She nodded, her face crumpling. I stood, pacing the room as the pieces clicked into place. The late nights, the hotel receipts, the flowers, it all made sense now. Why? I asked, my voice trembling. Why am? Laura shook her head, her tears spilling over. I don't know, she said softly. It wasn't about him, Mark. It was about me. I felt lost, invisible, and Elliot made me feel seen. Her words cut deeper than I thought possible. I'm your husband, I said, my voice breaking. That's my job, Laura. To make you feel seen. To make you feel loved. I know, she said, her voice trembling. But somewhere along the way, we lost that, and I didn't know how to tell you. The room fell silent, the weight of her confession pressing down on both of us. I sat back down, my hands covering my face as I tried to process everything. Do you love him? I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. No, she said quickly, her voice filled with desperation. It was never about love. It was a mistake, a terrible, stupid mistake. I wanted to believe her. But how could I? The following day, I called the yoga studio, asking to speak with Elliot. When he answered, his voice was calm, almost cheerful. This is Elliot, he said. It's Mark, I replied, my tone icy. Laura's husband. There was a long pause. I think we need to talk, I said. We met later that evening at a coffee shop across town. Elliot looked nervous, his usually confident demeanor replaced with something closer to fear. I assume you know why I'm here, I said, my voice steady. He nodded, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his coffee cup. Look, Mark, I never meant to hurt anyone. I never planned for this to happen. But it did, I said sharply. And now I want answers. Elliot sighed, running a hand through his hair. It started at the retreat, he admitted. We spent a lot of time together, and one thing led to another. And you thought that was okay? I asked, my anger bubbling over. No, he said quickly. It wasn't okay, and I regret it every day. But I can't undo what happened. His regret felt hollow, like an echo in an empty room. I want you to stay away from her, I said firmly. No more classes. No more conversations. Nothing. Do you understand me? Elliot nodded, his expression solemn. I understand, he said softly. When I returned home, Laura was waiting, her face pale and tear-streaked. Did you talk to him? She asked. I nodded. And it's over, I said. Her tears fell harder, but she didn't argue. The weight of everything settled over us like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable. For the first time in months, there were no more secrets between us. But the damage had been done. The house was eerily quiet. It had been 3 days since my confrontation with Elliot, 3 days since Laura begged me for forgiveness. The words had replayed in my mind on an endless loop. Her tearful confession, her insistence that it hadn't been about love, Elliot's hollow apologies. But now, there was only silence. I sat in the living room, staring at the shoebox of letters still on the coffee table. It felt like a bomb I couldn't disarm, a reminder of every betrayal I couldn't forget. Laura entered the room, her steps tentative. She had been walking on eggshells since that night, her usually confident demeanor replaced with a nervous energy that made her seem like a stranger. "Mark," she said softly, sitting across from me, "I know you're still angry, and you have every right to be. But I need to know, can we fix this? Can we move forward?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time, I saw something in her I hadn't before: fear. Real, raw fear. "I don't know," I said honestly, my voice heavy. "I don't know if I can trust you again." Her tears welled up, and she nodded, her hands trembling in her lap. "I understand," she said, "but I want to try. I want to do whatever it takes to make this right." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "It's not just about you and Elliot, Laura. It's about everything. The lies, the sneaking around, the fact that I had to find out on my own. You didn't just hurt me. You broke something between us." Her sobs came then, her body shaking as she buried her face in her hands. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it would be okay, but I couldn't bring myself to move. That night, I slept in the guest room. The next morning, Laura was gone before I woke up. A note on the counter said she had gone to her mother's for a few days to give me space. I appreciated the gesture, but the emptiness of the house only made the weight of everything harder to bear. I decided to clear my head. I grabbed my car keys and drove aimlessly, the hum of the engine the only sound as the miles stretched on. I found myself parked outside the yoga studio, staring at the familiar building. The thought of going inside made my chest tighten, but I couldn't shake the urge to confront the place where everything had started. I pushed open the door, the familiar scent of lavender and polished wood hitting me like a wave. The receptionist looked up, her smile faltering when she saw me. "Hi," she said cautiously. "Can I help you?" "I'm just looking," I said, my voice flat. She nodded, her eyes darting away nervously. I wandered into the main studio, the space empty and silent. The mirrors on the walls reflected my tired, haggard face back at me, a man I barely recognized. I sat down in the middle of the room, the polished wood cool beneath me. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe, trying to feel something other than anger and betrayal. A voice broke the silence. "Mark!" I opened my eyes to see Sandra, Elliot's assistant, standing in the doorway. She looked as surprised to see me as I was to see her. "What are you doing here?" she asked, stepping into the room. I shrugged, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know," I admitted. Sandra hesitated, then sat down across from me. "I heard about what happened," she said softly, "with Laura and Elliot." Her words sent a fresh wave of bitterness through me. "I'm sure everyone has," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. Sandra winced, but didn't argue. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry," she said. "You didn't deserve that." "Thanks," I said flatly. We sat in silence for a moment before Sandra spoke again. "You know, Elliot isn't who you think he is," she said carefully. I raised an eyebrow. "What's that supposed to mean?" Sandra sighed, her gaze dropping to the floor. "He's charming, manipulative. He has a way of making people feel special, like they're the only ones who matter. But it's all an act. He's done this before, Mark. With other students. With me." Her confession stunned me. "You?" She nodded, her expression pained. "It was years ago. I was new here, naive. He reeled me in just like he did with Laura. And when he got bored, he moved on." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Laura hadn't been the first, and she probably wouldn't be the last. "I'm sorry," Sandra said again, her voice soft. "For what it's worth, I think Laura does love you. She just got caught up in something she didn't understand." Her words lingered as I left the studio, the weight of everything pressing down on me even harder. When I got home, Laura's absence was palpable. I sat in the living room, staring at the shoebox of letters again. They felt different now, their significance dulled by what Sandra had told me. Elliot wasn't special. He was a predator. When Laura came back later that evening, she looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying. She sat across from me, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I talked to Sandra, I said, breaking the silence. Laura's eyes widened, and fresh tears filled them. "What did she say?" "She told me about Elliot, about how he manipulates people." Laura nodded, her shoulders shaking. "I didn't know," she said softly. "I didn't realize what he was doing until it was too late." Her words felt genuine, but the pain in my chest didn't lessen. "Laura," I said, my voice trembling. I don't know if we can fix this. Her tears fell harder, but she nodded. I understand, she said, but I want to try. I'll do whatever it takes. I sighed, the weight of the decision pressing down on me. It's going to take time, I said finally, and a lot of work. Her relief was visible as she nodded quickly. I'll do it, she said, whatever it takes.